Like a thunderclap, a mighty sound burst through the air, and the very earth trembled before its savagery. The voices of monsters great and terrible arose to sunder the heavens, throwing back the clouds and dashing the somber quietude of the bone vale. Together beneath a cacophony of roars, a flight of dragons emerged from the flying city. A multitude they were, two-winged beasts with 2 arms, 2 legs, serpent-like tails, and long necks ended in heads, crowned more often than not by horns and pointed ears. Yet in most other ways they were different, one from another. In many shapes and sizes they came, issuing from the high towers and the hidden ways of the city in the sky. Some there were of red, some of green, some of blue, some of brown, some of yellow, some of purple, some of black, some of white, and others yet had scales in every color for which there was a name. The dragons began to circle around the flying city, and soon, though not soon enough for Sven, who'd writhed in agony with his hands covering his ears, or for Remus, who had wormed his way into the folds of Sven's robes in a desperate and futile attempt to escape the dangerous noise, the howling ceased. The dragons wheeled about the walls of their lofty realm, forming a many-colored ring about it. When Sven could at last bear to uncover his ears, he turned his face upward. Even as his gaze focused once more upon the walls of the city, a commotion began. Small things, barely visible as specks of dust from where Sven lay, began to fall from the edges of the city. As he watched, the number of specks falling grew and grew until they formed an almost solid wall descending from the city. Sven's eyes opened wide, and he covered his mouth in grief-stricken horror. Baby dragons were being cast over the side of their sky-bound home. Hundreds fell, nay, thousands. Many of them managed to beat their tiny wings and bear themselves aloft to return to the walls of the home that had abandoned them. Hundreds achieved this escape, but for every 10 hatchlings that had the strength, 1 and more did not. These poor children fell and fell, plummeting toward the uncaring, bone-littered hills of the valley. Far off as they seemed, Sven could still hear the terrible sound of the first hatchlings smiting the distant hills. From where he lay, he could make out the grotesque remains of those unfortunate little dragons. More and more perished, adding to the multitude who had met this cruel fate before them, and not a single one of the adult dragons who circled high above went to their aid. Not one of the dragons that circled the flying city moved to aid the children as they smashed apart on the bones of their predecessors or fell into the river and were swept away. Sven was horror-struck, his hands pulling at his beard and his hair, and his heart screamed for the young ones, but there was nothing he could do. He could not save them. Even if he tried, the elder dragons would almost certainly descend, and that would be the end of him. Brought to extremity beyond all hope of redress, Sven simply watched, tears streaming down his cheeks, and blood flowing from the place in his lower lip where his teeth had bitten through the flesh, for the urge to cry out had been so overwhelming. The anguish of Sven's heart was not to go unheard, however. Another voice took up that grief and sundered the heavens with wrath. High above the young dragons falling, one of the towers on the border of the city erupted into a sudden flame. Emerald was that blaze, and in it was a force, like unto the fury of a mighty tempest, and the tower was obliterated in that terrible gale, and cast from the heights to rain down, spreading green inferno through the city, and to spill over its side. Even as the first fragments of that ruined tower fell past the lower reaches of the flying city's underbelly, another great cry went up. From the flaming ruin emerged a form vast and dark. As it came to stand upon the rubble of the tower, it took shape as a dragon, manyfold greater than any Sven had yet seen. A muscular behemoth was this beast, the very embodiment of physical might and power. When its wings came unfurled, they were thrice and again the span of even the broadest wing in the flying host. And when those wings beat, the fires died. With a great charge that sundered the tower beneath his feet, the enormous dragon hurtled over the side of the city and plummeted into the open air. Now free of smog and flame, Sven could perceive that the great dragon was covered in green scales, and the membranes of his bat-like wings were the color of fresh young grass in spring. Green also were his eyes, and they shined with an inborn light, alive with desperation. He beat his wings furiously, launching himself with all the speed that he could muster down toward the low hills of the bony vale, down to those poor children who could not return to their home and those whose wings had failed them. The great dragon went to the rescue of the little ones, bearing them up and keeping them from joining those who had failed the test before them on the hills. Indeed, he caught many in his enormous hands, and spreading out his wings to offer a platform for those beyond the reach of his arms, he brought salvation to scores more. Sven almost let out a shout for joy, but stifled it, because foreboding filled his heart. That foreboding was vindicated in most cruel fashion. A fleet of dragons broke from the ring circling the city and sped down toward the great green dragon. In their haste, they batted aside the children in their way, caring nothing for them, as they pursued with hatred the green one. The green dragon did not heed their approach. All of his attention and the whole of his thought was given to the falling children. Indeed, he had flown quite low in his efforts to save all that he could, being only a small distance from the tallest of the hills, as the other dragons drew nigh. Sven's hair blew in the wind of the dragon's wings, they were so close. "Halt!" the greatest of the lesser dragons thundered. "Halt, I say, old Keldabor!" The vast green dragon turned, craning his head upward on his long neck to look upon the others now following in his course. With a great beat of his wings, Keldabor stopped and hovered there in the sky, that he might face those who chased him. "Aid me in saving the little ones," he shouted at them in a voice so loud that the earth trembled. "Quickly now!" He began to turn to resume his efforts to rescue the little ones, but even as he did, one of the other dragons, a large brute with scales of sea blue, breathed a great gout of orange flame against him. Reflexively, Keldabor shielded himself against the blaze with his wings. The dragon fire washed over his hide, doing no true harm to him. But the little ones were not so fortunate. All those who had clung desperately to Keldabor's wings caught flame and screamed as they perished. Then, soundlessly, they fell from him and plummeted into the river below. "You will hear me, old Keldabor," repeated the leader of the dragons from the city. Keldabor drew his wings apart so that he could see what had transpired, and was stunned, simply staring in disbelief as the charred little forms splashed into the water and were lost. "You have interfered in our trial, and for that a harsh punishment would await." The leader, whose scales were green of a brighter shade than Keldabor's own, began. "Yet I esteem that you knew not the truth of it, and meant no offense. Come away now, venerated elder. Abandon the failures to their fate and be done with this folly. We shall speak of this matter at length in my—" His eyes exploding with green fire, Keldebor turned from shock and horror, peering on the river, to rage and retribution as he lifted his gaze to the other adult dragons. In a burst of speed so ferocious that it threw down the few desiccated trees that remained in the valley and threw the small river into tumult, Keldebor launched himself against the leader of the other dragons. Opening his mouth wide, Keldebor took the neck of the leader dragon in his teeth. So great was the disparity between them that Keldebor's jaws wrapped completely around the neck of his foe, and still had room to spare. The lesser dragon hadn't the time to realize his doom, or to act against it, before Keldebor crushed downward. There was a moment of delay, as the scales of the leader resisted Keldebor's fangs, but then the great dragon's teeth sank through, and with a sickening crack they broke the bones far beneath. Yet Keldebor did not stop at breaking. With one more great spurt of effort, he drove his fangs all the way through, clashing them viscerally together. Thus was the head of the dragon who'd spoken of failures and folly riven, and his neck split in two. Allowing his slain foe to fall in pieces to the bone-ridden vale, Keldebor spat the bloody remnant of his enemy's throat down after him, and turned to breathe a gout of green flame at the others. Most of them recovered from the shock of their captain's demise swiftly enough to evade Keldebor's attack, but 2 were not, and they were bathed in emerald fire. Terrible was the fire of Keldebor, and it had a power to kill even those of draconic race. The green flame kindled in them and burned them as though they were dry tinder and not fire-breathing dragons. So ended 2 more of the denizens of the flying city, and one of them was none other than the blue beast who had doused Keldebor in orange flames and murdered many of the children the old dragon had saved. Whilst the flaming ruin of those 2 plummeted down to scorch the vale below, Keldebor arose in wrath to strike at those who had fled from his deadly breath. The handful that remained of the party that had come to stop Keldebor from saving the young ones could not stand against his fury, and they fled upwards, trying to reach the safety of the multitude that still circled the city high above. Their flight was in vain. Keldebor was faster than any of them, and he slew them one and all, like a scythe through wheat. With his teeth he gnashed them, tearing out jugulars, and with the claws of his enormous hind feet he tore off the wings of one of them, sending him plummeting to his doom. Even as the last of them went screaming down into death, the ring that circled the city surged. Like a mighty river through the sky that had changed in its course, the ring broke and streamed now downwards, down to Keldebor and the little ones he still clutched in his mighty hands. Keldebor snarled defiantly at the flight of dragons now descending upon him. "May Numerambrum Kelveron curse you all, and rip from you your inheritance. You are no kin of mine. The black flame of the king take you all, and the house of Dagalor with you. Numenor is the rightful heir."